Throughout the 1600s, many attempts were made to improve upon the ignition of the matchlock. Some of these you might be familiar with, such as this wheel lock. Though very reliable, the wheel lock was slow to operate, expensive to manufacture, and difficult to maintain in the field. The wheel lock used hardened iron and a lump of iron pyrite in order to throw sparks and ignite the charge. This idea carried forward using hardened iron and a piece of flint and resulted in another weapon, the snafonce. After suitable modification, this evolved into the flintlock. Our sample today is a reproduction of a British Brown Bess and is quite representative of all flintlock smoothbore muskets. Though it may look a bit strange today, the flintlock was, for its day and age, quite simple and reliable. A hammer was mounted on the side of the weapon, powered by a spring and released by a trigger. This hammer had a set of screw jaws which held a piece of flint rigidly in place. At a point under the hammer's arc of travel, a touch hole was drilled to the interior of the barrel. Underneath this touch hole, a pan was mounted on the side of the weapon in which priming powder could be placed. On the forward edge of this pan, another spring-powered part, the frizzen, was mounted on a hinge. This frizzen served double duty. When the weapon was cocked, it covered the pan, keeping the priming powder in place. When the hammer was released and traveled forward, the flint struck the upper wing of the frizzen, causing sparks and knocking the frizzen forward. These sparks then fell into the pan, igniting the priming powder. As manufacturing and metallurgical skill increased, the weapons were made stronger. The shoulder-fired weapon decreased in weight to the point where a man could hold and fire it without use of the fork rest. Many methods of combining the pike with a firearm were tried, such as this plug bayonet. For obvious reasons, the plug bayonet was not entirely satisfactory. Within a few short years, however, this had evolved into the socket bayonet, wherein a sleeve slipped over and locked onto the outside of the muzzle of the weapon. These developments all came together in the Flintlock smoothbore musket, which was in general issue by the early 1700s. The Flintlock smoothbore was loaded from a paper cartridge. This is not a cartridge as you understand it today, but simply a paper envelope containing a pre-measured amount of powder and a leaden ball. The soldier drew the paper cartridge from his ammunition pouch and tore the cartridge in half by biting on the ball and wrenching the remainder of the paper away. He then poured a small amount of powder into the priming pan, closed the frizzen, and dropped the ball on the ground. The remainder of the powder was poured down the barrel and the paper discarded. He then took the leaden ball from his teeth and dropped it down the barrel, discarding any paper which remained. You should note that though the bore of the Brown Bess ran from 73 to 75 caliber, it fired a 69 caliber ball. All Flintlock smoothbores used balls of similar undersized dimensions. This was done because black powder, a mixture of charcoal, saltpeter, and sulfur, left behind large quantities of fouling in the barrel. If the weapon was to be loaded after 4 or 5 shots, this gap between the ball and barrel had to exist or the ball could not be rammed home. After dropping the ball into the barrel, the soldier withdrew the ramrod, rammed the ball home, and returned the ramrod underneath the barrel. He then placed the weapon to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. You should also understand that the soldier did not aim. The sloppy fit between barrel and ball made the weapon hopelessly inaccurate. Aiming, therefore, was really of no consequence whatsoever. What you think is a front sight mounted on this weapon is in fact a bayonet lug. It couldn't be placed on the underside of the weapon because that's where the ramrod had to go. In use, the whole thing looked something like this. Our shooter has fired 5 shots in roughly 1 minute and 12 seconds. You can see how much fouling has been left behind on the weapon and on his hands with such relatively little firing. His target represented a formation of men. The inaccuracy of the weapon is readily obvious. The 5 hits from 7 shots total are circled in red. On our chart, however, the Brown Bess looks quite good. You will note that it has roughly the same range as the Matchlock, and yet its volume of fire is easily triple that of the Matchlock. Further, the chart does not tell the whole story. With the bayonet affixed to this weapon, there was no longer a need for the pike. Now every man could be issued a musket, and every man could fire. The changes wrought by the emphasis on gunfire were immense. Gone were the tercios of the Spanish and the brigades of the Swedish. Instead, the line formation was instituted. Depending upon the nation involved, this varied from 2 to 5 ranks deep and generally employed volley fire by platoon or by rank. Though the line formation does allow every man to fire his weapon, it is unwieldy. This created a need for drill. The musket's rate of fire depended upon its mechanical manipulation by the soldier. This created still more need for drill. You should also remember that the weapon had to be fired from a standing position, and that most of the time the soldier was working on loading the musket, not on firing it. Since he was 60 yards or less from the enemy, the volleys that came crashing into his ranks killed or wounded many of those about him. The only way to keep the soldier efficiently at his task of loading and firing the musket was to emphasize discipline and drill above all other soldierly qualities. The smoothbore musket and line formation evolved into what we call linear warfare. It was carried to its height by Frederick the Great. In addition to instituting a rigidity in drill and discipline which no other army could match, Frederick also introduced the iron ramrod. Unlike the normal wooden ramrod of the day, the iron ramrod could be plied vigorously, regardless of how foul the barrel became. In Frederick's army, rates of fire frequently reached 5 rounds per minute, and his battalions took on the nickname of walking batteries. A good example of the effect of this volume of fire is the Battle of Minden in 1759. In this battle, the Prussians, with their Hanoverian and British allies, literally blew the French cavalry off the field with a storm of lead. Cavalry never again formed up on the main line of battle. Despite this emphasis on fire, one cannot ignore the bayonet. Even 5 rounds a minute could not always prevent enemy infantry or cavalry from reaching your position. But the bayonet could stop the horses of the cavalry, and when the enemy was demoralized, by the untiring fury of the crashing volleys, he could frequently be pushed from the field by the judicious application of the bayonet. Though it may look crude today, the Flintlock smoothbore musket was a vast improvement over anything that had gone before. When complemented with the organization, the drill, the tactics, the drill, the discipline, and the incessant, mind-numbing drill of linear warfare, the Flintlock smoothbore and the bayonet were extremely effective weapons.